Welcome to the class. Today I will be starting with GS paper 2. Normally we start GS paper 2 with the constitution, but in this batch I will be starting with India and the world section. There are various reasons behind it. One of the reason is that normally this part gets neglected, so I don't want the part gets neglected in GS and we do it properly, because around 50 marks questions will come from here. Another thing is there is no need to refer to any material. There is a misconception among the students as if this part is current affairs. It's not like that. There are a lot of thematic historical issues which, and the conceptual of course, which you have to understand. Since right now we are conducting the classes in a online mode, I will be using the board and I will expect students to make the notes side by side. So let's start India and the world. I am starting with India and the world portion. India and the world portion, again, don't think it is current affairs. Fine, international relations is a proper subject and you have to understand the core of it. Okay, so the first topic in your syllabus is India and neighborhood. India and its neighborhood policy. Fine, so we will focus on India and its neighborhood policy. So first of all, let us understand this word policy. In order to get good marks, it is very important that you have the conceptual clarity. Fine, and each and every word that we use, we should be able to explain. Suppose if a question is come, what is policy? You should be able to understand each and every word. This is what I have concluded or analyzed from this year's mains paper. Okay, so first of all, let us understand the term policy. And you can write side by side. Fine. So India's foreign policy. Here I am giving weightage on the term policy. India's foreign policy. So suppose in interviews they ask you what is policy. Fine, how do you define policy? So what is policy? This is what we have to understand. The second thing is, there can be a question whether India has a foreign policy or not. Fine, so do we have a policy? Do we have the neighborhood policy, or we are just working on the reactions? So do we have a policy? Fine, so why I am discussing the term policy is that you can answer this question. Suppose somebody asks you this question: do you think India has a foreign policy? Or since we are doing India and the neighborhood, they can ask you a question: do you think India has a neighborhood policy? Suppose this is your first question: do you think India has a policy? What will be your answer? You will be able to give the answer only when you know what is a policy, what are its components, and you should also be able to know, after all, why this question. How can a country like India run without a policy? Fine. So this is something, a very serious issue. Don't take it superficially. My question, and try to ask this, try to find out the answer, that whether India has a foreign policy. If you say in affirmative yes, my second question will be, what are the components of this policy? Okay, so the question is, do you think India has a foreign policy? Fine. So basically, we have to understand why this question what constitutes a policy, what are the components of policy. Fine. So the first particular question, why this question, that India has a foreign policy or not, and whether we have a sound policy or we require a course correction. Fine. So first question, why this question, that whether India has a foreign policy. Why the question whether India has foreign policy or not. Fine. Why this question? This question is because it is often said. The question is, it is often said that India does not have a coherent foreign policy. So if you will read the academic articles on India's foreign policy, you will find that it is often said that India does not have a coherent foreign policy. Okay? Means, I hope you have been able to write, India does not have a coherent foreign policy. Means so-called India's foreign policy. So-called India's foreign policy is a set of knee-jerk reactions. Fine. So India's so-called foreign policy is less of a policy and it is more of a knee-jerk reactions. Means our foreign policy is more reactive in nature. It is not proactive in nature. Fine. So India's foreign policy is a set of knee-jerk responses. Fine. So to understand any subject, even if it is in general studies, you have to have some basic understanding of the concepts and the terminology of the subject. So I always emphasize on students developing the language of the subject which they are studying. Fine. So when you say India doesn't have a foreign policy, I hope you are writing side by side. It has certain knee-jerk responses and second, it's a piecemeal approach. It is a piecemeal approach. So knee-jerk responses means our approach is reactive and not proactive. For example, we are doing something in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka as a reaction to the Chinese activity in these countries. Fine. So we have a piecemeal approach, means there is a lack of coherence. There is lack of coherence. There is a lack of unified vision in the foreign policy. This is what is assumption. So we have to first understand what is a policy. In order to understand what is a policy, we have to first make a distinction between a policy and a decision. Fine. So policy is to be distinguished. The term policy is to be distinguished from a problem solving. So at times our foreign policy looks more like a problem solving rather than policy. Fine. And the second is decisions. I will add ad hoc decisions. Fine. So foreign policy is neither a problem solving nor an ad hoc decision. Unfortunately, India's foreign policy often reflect these two features, as if it is about the problem solving and about the ad hoc decisions. Okay, so problem solving, for example, China is present in Sri Lanka, it becomes a problem, and hence we started greater engagement with Sri Lanka. A problem come and then you start solving. So problem solving is considered as a reactive approach. Fine. Whereas policy making is a proactive approach. Fine. So problem solving is reactive, whereas policy is proactive. I know you must be getting this question, why ma'am is emphasizing so much on proactive, what does that mean? So I'll come to that. Fine, but I want this word should get imprinted here. And a decision cannot be a policy. Fine. So set of decisions which have a coherence. So basically ad hoc decisions cannot be a policy. Fine. So basically policy will be set of coherent decisions. It will be a set of coherent decisions. Suppose Prime Minister Modi goes to Nepal and says that he is interested in developing the enduring partnership and friendship with Nepal. Next day, Nepal brings its own constitution, which is not in accordance to what India wanted. Third day, we impose undeclared blockade. So will you consider it as a policy, or will you consider it set of ad hoc decisions which lack coherence. Okay, so hopefully you are getting the feel of the point which I am trying to make. Okay, so now let us understand policy. Policy is called as decision making policy is called as decision making, which is different from a problem solving. How and why? Because in problem solving, problem is given. For example, China in Sri Lanka. The problem is given and we look for responses. Fine. However, in case of policy making, it is proactively. You are proactively. In policy making, we are proactively looking at the problems, proactively looking at the problems. You can even say you yourself is creating issues and looking for alternatives and looking for alternatives. Creating issues and looking for alternatives proactively. For example, if I give you an example of USA, USA reflects policy making and not the responses. There is a vision which USA has, and USA goes for creating the issues. For example, USA has a vision to establish its hegemony in the world, to establish its hegemony in Middle East. Hence, USA has proactively created scenario in Middle East where USA's leadership will be needed. So in 2008 or in 2003, USA has invaded Iraq. So there was no provocation from Iraq, yet USA invaded Iraq because USA had some vision. So USA is creating the problem and offering the solutions. Fine. So in policy making, you create issues You look for the issues and you also look for the alternatives to solve those issues. You don't throw the ball in somebody else's court. It's not that somebody has thrown the ball and you are responding. Rather, you are deciding how and where the ball is to be thrown. Hopefully, you are understanding what I mean to say. Fine. So it is like creating issue and suggesting the alternatives. Fine. So policy making is creating issues. Simple thing is try to be proactive. Look for the issues. Don't just respond. Fine. And policy provides a larger vision. Fine. So policy provides a larger vision within which and in accordance to which you take decisions. So policy provides a larger vision within which decisions are taken, within which the decisions are taken so that decisions do not appear ad hoc or incoherent, because ad hoc and incoherent decision gives very confusing signals not only to international community but to your own people, your businessmen. Because in foreign policy, suppose in India and Nepal, lot of actors are involved. It's not that only bureaucracy is involved, business is involved, civil society is involved. So it always gives the confusing signal and a country may not get the optimal result. So wherever, even if it's about preparation of civil services, ad hocism, incoherence is not expected because you will not get the optimal result. There has to be a vision within which you have to operate. Is that clear? So this is in general characteristic of a policy. So what we are going to do, India's neighborhood policy, and we have understood policy. The reason is, after this particular topic, you should be able to take a stand whether India has a neighborhood policy. Second, whether India has a sound neighborhood policy or not. Fine. So now let us come from policy in general to the foreign policy in particular. Just like there is an economic policy, there is a social policy, so there is also a foreign policy. So, what do you understand by a foreign policy? Even our neighborhood policy is a subset of that foreign policy. So, we have to understand what exactly is a very basic understanding of foreign policy. So, foreign means national versus foreign. Our nationals and foreigners. Fine. So national means domestic, foreign means outside borders. So you can say foreigner and nationals or citizens. Fine. So the domestic policies and foreign policy is your policy with the actors which are outside of your borders. Fine. So domestic versus outside borders. Fine. So you understand that international sphere or international politics is how international sphere, how international system or society is organized. So international sphere is organized in the form of nation states. Fine. So our international society is divided into the nation states. We live in a particular nation. Fine. The nation states, we live under a particular nation. Okay. So entire global population is divided into different nations. Fine. So international sphere we find what nation states. For example, India is a nation state. Pakistan is a nation state. Bangladesh is a nation state. Fine. So earlier, before 1947, it was a subcontinent. In 1947, two nation states were created on this Indian subcontinent. One is India, the other is Pakistan. Fine. And since before, India, Pakistan or Delhi, Lahore relations were domestic, but after that they become external. So international world is, or the people of the world, they live under the nation states. So what are the nation states? Basically, they are the territorial entities. They are territorial entities. Fine. So every nation state has a fixed boundary. So every nation state has its fixed boundary. Fine. They are the territorial entities. They have their fixed boundaries. This is something very, very important. And nation, in the sense, what is nation? A sort of a psychological feeling of oneness. We don't have to go into the detail of it. Fine. For example, during national movement, Muslim League talked about two nations. Two nations have to be created on this subcontinent, India and Pakistan. Fine. So feeling of oneness is the psychological, or nation is more of a psychological or a cultural notion. In general studies, we don't have to go into the detail of it. The only thing you have to understand is fixed boundaries. For example, in 1947, Radcliffe Line created two nation states, India and Pakistan. And in 1971, Pakistan was further partitioned and Bangladesh was created, and the three nations came into existence. So when India conducts its relations with Bangladesh, it is called as a foreign policy. Fine. So basically, foreign policy is the conduct of the relations between a nation state. Foreign policy is the sphere where you are conducting the relations. Now, relations can be political or diplomatic, economic, cultural, or security, defense, whatever. So when you conduct the relations between a nation state and other nation states, means those who are existing outside of our domestic boundaries. So those which are existing outside our domestic boundaries. So this, a country may have domestic policy and a foreign policy. So foreign policy is conducting the relations with the other nation states. Fine. Now you also need to understand that at present international politics is not confined to nations. At present, international politics is not confined to the nation states only. Okay, so international politics includes even international organizations, regional organizations. India has relations with APEC also. India SCO relations also you have to study. India and WTO also you have to study. Plus non-state actors you also have it. So within your foreign policy, even non-state actors also have a role. Among the non-state actors, we can put terrorist groups. For example, India dealing with Taliban is about dealing with a terrorist organization. So terrorist groups, MNCs, and non-governmental organizations, for example, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, etc. So all these things come within the sphere of any country's external relations. Fine. So in foreign policy, it's not that we have to just study nation state centric, we have to study society centric, and we have to include other actors also. Even if you are not understanding, just ignore. The only thing is you have to understand that in foreign policy we study how one nation conducts its relations with the outside world. Fine. So in short we can say it is how a nation state conducts its relations with the outside world. Fine. So in your syllabus also they have given India and international organizations, etc. So the question is how a nation conducts its relations with the outside world. Outside means out of the borders. And what are the actors with which you will be interacting? The actors outside world. What all actors come under the outside world? Other nations, states, international organizations, regional organizations, NGOs, terrorist organizations, MNCs, which all have a presence beyond nation, means which are transnational in their reach. For example, we will study India's relations with China. You will study India's relations with in WTO, UN. You study India and EU relations, NGOs, and all these things, you study about human rights, you study about the various aspects. Okay. So now, theoretically, what is the core objective of any country's foreign policy? When any country deals with the other country, what is the core objective? Fine. So we have to understand what is the core objective of any country's foreign policy. Fine. So the basic question is, when a foreign policy is formulated, what is the core objective? What is the ultimate objective behind a policy? When you are dealing with the outside world, what is your ultimate objective or the core objective? Core objective has to be understood. For example, so when a country interacts with the outside world, comma, what objective it seeks to achieve. So ultimately, what are we trying to achieve? Every policy has its objectives. So while conducting a foreign policy, ultimately what are we seeking to achieve? Okay. So ultimately, when India is interacting with Nepal, are we interacting with some altruistic motive? What are we seeking to achieve? Fine. For example, when we provide vaccines to LDCs, fine. So what is the motive? Is it about altruism? Are we guided by the cosmopolitan vision of our culture, or it is realism, or protection of the self or the national interest? So when you say that we do not have enough vaccines at home, why India is exporting vaccines abroad, so it's not sheer altruism, it is also a way to help in advancing our own core interest. So you have to go little bit deeper. So altruism can be one of the factor. We belong to a civilization where these have been the values, but at the core, policies, foreign policies are conducted in a very professional, it's a very professional sphere where the core interest is going to be our national interest. Fine. So you have to understand that the core objective of the foreign policy of any country is preservation and promotion of its national interest. The core objective of the foreign policy of any country is the preservation and the promotion of its national interest. Fine. So national interest is supreme. As a ambassador, as a diplomat, what will be your chief responsibility? To protect the national interest. Now the question comes, what constitutes a national interest? Fine. So what is the national interest? The objective of the foreign policy of any country is the protection and the promotion of national interest. But the question is, what is national interest? What constitutes the national interest? So let me tell you that in the theory of international relations, national interest is considered as an ambiguous term. It's an ambiguous term. It is difficult to define very exactly what all constitutes the national interest. Fine. And then there are the scholars. For example, there is one very famous scholar, Morgenthau. In general studies, you don't have to mention these scholars, but you have to know these scholars. Fine. So Morgenthau, he divides the national interests into two types. Core and secondary, peripheral, or basically vital, core or vital. So there are certain national interests which are core, which are vital, which cannot be compromised. Fine. So let's forget the secondary national interests. Let us understand the core national interest. Means can't be compromised. Fine. So something which is core, which is vital, which is fundamental, and there is no chance of any compromise. So we can narrow down the definition of our foreign policy, and we can say that if a question is asked, what is the ultimate objective of India's foreign policy? Your simple answer can be, the ultimate objective is to secure the core national interests. Fine. So it's about preservation and the promotion of the core national interest. I can leave the promotion at least if we think we are able to preserve our core national interest. That is also enough to say that our foreign policy is a successful one. Fine. So I can narrow it down and I can just let it be that the ultimate objective of the foreign policy of any country is the preservation, I am even not including promotion, the preservation of its core oblique vital national interests. Forget promotion, even if it is preservation, it is fine. Preservation of its core vital interest. Now the question is, what are the core interests? What constitutes core interest? Or if I ask you a very simple question, what are the core interests of India's, what are the core national interest of India? So as I told you in the beginning or earlier also, that national interest is a very ambiguous term, and the countries define their core national interest according to their convenience. For example, US officials define the rule-based order in Asia Pacific as their core national interest. Jimmy Carter has defined US hegemony in Middle East as its core national interest. So it depends. But forget superpowers. If we talk at a very basic level, the first and foremost responsibility of the foreign policy of any country is, or that is for India also, is the preservation of its a territorial integrity. preservation of its territorial integrity. Fine. So if we end up losing our own territory, it is the biggest failure of our foreign policy. And I need not to remind that a significant chunk of our territory of Jammu and Kashmir is under Pakistan's occupation. Similarly, in Aksai Chin, China occupies India's territory, which itself is a very big question mark on India's foreign policy. So one of the core national interest we can say is the preservation of the territorial integrity, and the second is the safety and the security of its people. At least a country should be able to protect the lives of its people. Fine. From the wars, from the terrorist attacks. Fine. So safety and security. So when our foreign minister visits Sri Lanka or Nepal or Pakistan or anywhere, these are certain aims. Like when we talk about peace with Pakistan, this is a non-compromising thing, that we cannot compromise with our territorial integrity. We cannot compromise with the safety and security of our people. I believe these are the two most vital of the national interests. To this, we can add economic development, because our ability to achieve these two interests, maintaining the territorial integrity and the safety and security of our people, will depend considerably on our economic resources or our economic strength. So I will put economic strength also, or economic objectives also, as very much within the definition of India's core national interest. So when we deal with our neighbors, we have to ensure that the neighbors do not make any attempt either on their own or in connection with the external powers like China, which results into any compromise with either our territorial integrity or with the safety and security of our people. At the same time, we should be able to enhance our prosperity. So these remain the underlying principles of any foreign policy, and this economic angle is very, very vital, because if I talk about like this economic growth is always a foundation for the sound foreign policy. Fine. So let's see India's neighborhood first policy. Ultimately, the idea is that we have to have the economic growth because only then we can generate the resources to protect our territory and to protect our people. Fine. So in this context, I can refer to Pandit Nehru, the chief architect of India's foreign policy, who held that foreign policies are the derivatives of economic policies. So economic policies shape the foreign policy a lot, and they are very closely connected. If I can also mention about Kautilya, the famous strategist, and Kautilya's master craft is Arthashastra, and in Arthashastra he has primarily discussed the foreign and the security policy. So Arthashastra is a book of Rajniti, where he has emphasized on the foreign and security policy and named it as Arthashastra, where Arth means economy. Fine. So economy, economic gains, this is going to be always the defining feature. So you will understand it gradually. The only thing is, the point which I am making here is that since the ancient time, the close connection has been realized between countries' economic power and its ability to conduct a successful foreign policy aiming at the safety and security of its people and preserving its territorial integrity. And when we compare ourselves with China, what we find is China has a bigger influence in South Asia. The reason is China has much bigger pockets. So maybe there is a big gap between our aims and the means, which is also one of the factors that our foreign policy is suboptimal. Okay, so hopefully you are understanding the basics of this approach. So I hope you are getting the background and conditioning your mind for before starting the neighborhood policy, like what all do we expect from a policy. So the core objective of our foreign policy or any country's foreign policy is the preservation of its core national interest, and the core national interest is at least ensuring its territorial integrity and the safety and the security of its people. Okay, so now let us understand the factors which are also called as the determinants. Factors or the determinants of foreign policy. What are the factors or the determinants of foreign policy? What all shapes a foreign policy? Will a foreign policy of China is going to be similar to the foreign policy of India? Not necessarily. The factors shaping the foreign policy the most important factor is supposed to be geography. We will see the impact of geography in India's foreign policy, country's history. For example, India and Pakistan continues to be the prisoners of the past. Whether it is India, Pakistan or India, China, much of the relationship in present is shaped by the history. Obviously, country's economy. Suppose if we have closed economy, our interaction with the neighbors are going to be limited. But if we have an open economy, obviously we have to go for more trade. So economic factor, political factors will also play the role. For example, if there is a democracy, if there is a real democracy in Pakistan, then there is a possibility of improvement in the relations between India and Pakistan. But if Pakistan is a fake democracy and is ruled by the army, and if India is also not a true democracy but a mobocracy, then obviously this is going to make an impact on the relations. Again, leadership plays a role, and the institutions. For example, how robust is our Ministry of External Affairs, Indian Foreign Services, think tanks, all these things play the role. And also the world order, how the things are happening, what are the system defining events. For example, COVID-19 can be considered as one system defining event which has brought the huge disruption and the changes and necessitates the changes in the foreign policy. So we also have to keep these factors in mind, how Nepal's political system shapes India's responses, how India's economic needs shapes India's engagement with the countries in the region, how what is the role of the leadership, etc. Fine. So these are certain factors which you should keep it in mind. Now, our topic is India's neighborhood policy. So, why? This is the first topic in your syllabus and what is its importance. Fine. So, if we go by the theories of foreign policy, the first and the foremost priority of any country continues to be the neighborhood. Fine. So, India's neighborhood policy, we have to understand that the priority of any country's foreign policy is bound to be neighborhood. Fine. So the priority of any country's foreign policy is bound to be the neighborhood. Neighborhood will, in fact, is seen as the test of the foreign policy. How important, how good your relations with your neighbors show how efficient your foreign policy, your diplomacy is. Fine. So, undoubtedly, the priority of any country's foreign policy is bound to be its neighborhood. Fine. And why? To I can to quote Shyam Saran, one of our former foreign secretary. And what does he say? He says that the logic of geography is unrelenting. Fine. So, the logic of geography is unrelenting means obviously the neighborhood is going to be the biggest priority for any country's foreign policy. As you know that Prime Minister Modi has launched the neighborhood first policy. Fine. So neighborhood first. This phrase itself shows the priority a country has to give to its neighbors. Fine. Because the logic of geography is unrelenting. And if I quote Vajpayee, our former Prime Minister, in 2003, he held that we can change our neighbors, we can change our neighbors, but we cannot change. He said that we can change our friends, but we cannot change our neighbors. Fine. It means it is a compulsion for India to have the better relations with the neighbors. Fine. We can also say that we can change history because that is in our hand. If you want, you can definitely change the history, but we cannot change geography. So even if we want, we cannot place ourselves in the secure neighborhood like USA. Fine. So you have to live with this fact. Not only India has to live with the fact that Pakistan is our neighbor, even Pakistan and other smaller countries of South Asia, they have to live with this particular fact that India is huge, India is big, and even if they want, they cannot change the neighbors. So having a good relations with the neighbors is obviously a compulsion for India, but it is also compulsion for the neighbors, and even if we want, we cannot change this fact, and we have to live with this particular fact. Fine. So that is the importance. Fine. And why this is important? Why neighbors have to be prioritized? Fine. Because the principal source of threat to the integrity, to the security, emanates from the frontiers. Fine. So why neighbors have to be prioritized? Because the principal source of threat they emerge in our neighborhood. The principal source of threat, fine, will come from neighbors. And in case of India, when you have the porous boundaries, you have to be very, very cautious. So the source of threat, the principal source of threat to India's security emanate from its periphery. Fine. If I quote Kautilya, so Kautilya's wisdom says that your neighbor is your natural enemy. So the principal threat to any country's security emanate from the neighbors. Neighbors are the natural enemy, and hence we have to emphasize that we have safe and secure neighborhood. Fine. So there is a need for the safe and secure neighborhood. So neighbors are principal source of insecurity in conventional sense, though for a country like India we have lot of internal security issues. So our foreign policy has to ensure a safe and secure neighborhood. Now, the second thing is prosperity. Fine. So, if we go for prosperity logic, then neighbors are the first source of raw materials, then neighbors are always the first market for the finished goods and services, and if the relations with the neighbors are good enough, then you can develop the regional and the global supply chains for a shared prosperity. So if you are thinking about prosperity, if you are thinking about the social and economic development at home, you have to look towards the neighbors first. So neighbors are vital, and that is why the two key objectives of India's neighborhood first policy, as mentioned by our Minister of State for External Affairs, is to achieve the safe and secure neighborhood and to create a zone of, it means to create a zone of peace. So basically, one of the objective of India's neighborhood first policy is the establishment of the peaceful periphery, and second, a zone of prosperity, or I can say a shared zone of prosperity, means the developmental cooperation. Fine. So a country, you should have an answer to this question, why a country has to prioritize its relationship with its neighbors. The answer is safety and prosperity. The first destination and the first challenge emerge from the frontiers. Okay. Now, if I say the significance of neighborhood for any country's foreign policy, and if I quote one of the experts on India's neighborhood policy, S.D. Muni, you can say that no country can achieve the great power status at international level without establishing its leadership in its own region. So if India aspires to be a great power, because being a power gives you privilege. You will have a capacity to define and to shape the events and to fulfill your interest much in a much better way. And but if you desire to be the great power, you have to first mend your fences. You have to first improve your relations with your neighbors. Fine. Similarly, I can mention about C. Raja Mohan, and in his article 5 point someone written in Indian Express, he has explained the rationale for the neighborhood first. He has explained the rationale behind the neighborhood first policy, because without having the safe and secure neighborhood, India cannot fulfill its global ambitions. So obviously we have to prioritize towards our neighbors. So you should be in a position to explain why it is important to have a strong neighborhood policy and to have good relations with the neighbors, because obviously in order for your security you need economic power. For economic power you require trade, you require commerce, so you require cheap raw material, you require the markets, and neighbors have the vital role in this particular context. Fine. So you should be able, before start, you should be able to understand the rationale behind or importance of having the good neighborhood relations. Now, we have to understand what is the state of relations between India and its neighbors. What is the state of relations between India and its neighbors? The simple answer is not good, and they were never good. Fine. It's not that we have never tried to improve the relations, but we have never met the objectives of having a peaceful periphery in our neighbors. So we can understand, we can say that obviously the relations are neither good and they were never good. In short, we do not have the good record as far as improvement of the relationship with the neighbors is concerned, and we can say that South Asia is among the least integrated region in the world, and not only it is least integrated region in the world, South Asia is also known as the most dangerous place in the world. So if you read a book by Avinash Paliwal, he mentions that in USA, India is, or South Asia is considered as the most dangerous place in the world because it being a site for a probable nuclear flashpoint, because the two nuclear powers without any arms control agreement and with the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons by the non-state actors. So the situation continues to be, it is not good as far as the security is concerned. One of the most dangerous places in the world and one of the least integrated region in the world with, you can say, continues to be the home to the largest number of poor in the world. So I can say that India has, fine, so in neither augurs well with respect to prosperity nor augurs well with respect to security, and we can say that India has one of the most troublesome neighborhood. Fine. So if we leave Middle East, we can say that India around the world has the most troublesome neighborhood, and we can say that the neighbors create the existential crisis for India. Forget the prosperity, they create the existential crisis for India. And we have to understand that there is a huge asymmetry between the size, the power of India and the neighbors, yet the smaller neighbors of India they prove to be quite consequential. Fine. So we should be aware of this fact that there is a big asymmetry in size, yet we are neither able to establish India's dominance, neither we have been successful in establishing the power of coercion or the power of attraction, and the smaller neighbors they prove to be too consequential, too troublesome, a very big headache for the neighbors. For India means the smaller neighbors of India they continue to punch beyond their weight. So it is too irritating, we can say, that the smaller neighbors are too consequential, they pose the existential threat, and they punch beyond the weight, and they perplex India a lot in shaping and determining the foreign policy. Keep these things in mind. They are too small, but they are too troublesome. So India has a weight, but it is unable to punch according to its weight. But the neighbors, they are in a position to punch beyond their weight, and that is a sad paradox from the point of India. The reasons are many. What are the reasons behind having the troubled neighborhood? Fine. So what are the reasons behind India's troubled neighborhood? Reasons are many. Asymmetry of power creates big and small neighbor syndrome. Fine. So neighbors also suffer from the syndrome. As a result, they look for external balancer. Unfortunately, this external balancer is China. So China is the main elephant in the room. So our neighborhood first policy is too much China centric. Suppose this question comes that do you think India's neighborhood policy is very much China centric. So the biggest elephant in the room is China. Had there been no China, most probably the nature of India-Nepal relations, India-Pakistan relations would have been very, very different. Fine. So obviously we can say that China is the main elephant in the room, and the reason behind, obviously, geography, that China is our neighbor. Geography is a factor. Fine. So elephant in the room, you have to understand that what are the reasons. Obviously asymmetry is a reason, China is a reason, unresolved disputes from land to border, land to water, sovereignty issues, domestic politics, identity issues, they have played the role. These factors, they add to the trust deficit, and we are not able to find the meaningful solutions to these problems so far. Or we can say, we can also add the colonial past, the bitter memory of partition. But if I am looking for an umbrella term, we can say that we have failed to evolve a sound neighborhood policy. So why India has the troubled neighborhood? The reasons are many, from asymmetry to Chinese ambitions, or the role of external powers, the unresolved disputes from land to water, as well as you can say the domestic politics in different countries, but obviously the bitter memories of the past and our inability to erase them, our tendency to cling to the past, to linger with the past. But all these things ultimately point towards one thing, one very generic issue, our inability to craft a sound neighborhood policy. Okay, so now we have to understand the features, we have to understand the features of India's neighborhood policy. We have to understand the features of India's neighborhood policy, and we have to analyze, we have to critically analyze the strengths and the weaknesses we have to critically analyze the strengths and the weaknesses of India's neighborhood policy, and we have to suggest a way forward. We have to see the strengths and the weaknesses, we have to see the achievements and the failures, we have to see the problems, the obstacles, and we have to look for the solutions. We have to define what is the way forward. So that is the scope of India's neighborhood policy. So you can say that India's neighborhood policy has been the work in progress. If in one line I have to explain India's neighborhood policy, I can simply say that India's neighborhood policy is the work in progress, in the sense that we have to understand India's neighborhood policy is evolving. We have to understand the evolution of India's neighborhood policy, and in different stages. So basically the policy, neighborhood policy, has been the work in progress, and we have to understand the evolution. So in order to understand India's neighborhood policy, in order to go for the critical evaluation of India's neighborhood policy, I will adopt the historical approach, and we will see that how our neighborhood policy is evolving, and we will also see that whether there is more of a continuity or change. Is there is anything new in Modi's policy from Nehru's policy? What are the elements of continuity and the elements of change in our foreign policy? Let's have a glance of the evolution of India's neighborhood policy. So, starting with the Nehru years. What has been the salient features of India's neighborhood policy? Let's have a look at Nehru years. Fine. So obviously Pandit Nehru has been not only our first prime minister, he was also our first foreign minister, and he has been the chief architect of India's foreign policy, and he has laid the foundation of India's foreign policy, and that is why we have to understand India's foreign policy starting with Pandit Nehru. There can be a question whether do you see a continuity and change in India's foreign policy. So starting with Pandit Nehru. So Pandit Nehru's foreign policy vision. Fine. So regarding Pandit Nehru, you have to understand what was his vision, what was his vision, what was his approach, what was his vision, what was his approach towards the international politics. At the same time, with Pandit Nehru, you have to answer this question that whether India's foreign policy under Nehru reflect a distinct break from the past, or whether it was the continuation of the policies of the Raj. You have to have clarity on these questions. What was Nehru's vision towards the world affairs? Is there originality in Nehru's policy? And whether, especially in context of the neighborhood, we see more of a continuity than a change. So if you have answer to these questions, you will get more of a clarity. So if we see in terms of foreign policy, or in terms of international affairs, the common perception has been that Nehru was an idealist. The common perception or misperceptions about Pandit Nehru's foreign policy has been that Nehru was more of a idealist, and Nehru focused more on, Nehru focus more. So let us understand what is the common. What we are understanding is Nehru's neighborhood policy. Now, what is the perception? What is the general perception about Nehru? Perception often differs from the reality. You get the perceptions, or when you stick or your source of knowledge to YouTube channels or the mass media, what you get is a perception and not the facts. In order to understand the facts, you have to move beyond the YouTube channels and you have to read some standard texts. So, what is the perception? There are two perceptions about Pandit Nehru's approach to foreign policy. Was point number one, Nehru was an idealist, and point number two, Nehru's focus was on abroad and he neglected the neighborhood. Fine. So this has been the perception. This perception gets all the more solidified when we use the phrases like neighborhood first, as if we, for the first time, we are having this neighborhood first, and maybe the Nehruvian approach was not of the neighborhood first, and his approach was as if he was more interested in what was happening in Korea or what was happening in Israel and was less interested in its own region. So these are some perceptions you often find, and these perceptions basically is Nehru neglected the neighborhood. These perceptions get solidified when you coin the phrases like neighborhood first, as if this is the first time we are prioritizing the neighborhood, and as if the governments in the past have neglected the neighborhood. So whether there is an element of truth or more of a perception or fiction, that we have to understand. And we have to understand that howsoever naive a person is, if he is a foreign minister, no one can afford to neglect the neighborhood. It's a different thing that things do not move in the direction you expect. At times there are many unintended consequences, but you cannot say that there has not been a well thought of neighborhood policy. Fine. So the perception that Nehru was an idealist and he neglected the neighborhood. What does that mean when I say with this perception that Pandit Nehru was idealist. So the question is, what do we mean by being an idealist in international politics? So in order to understand, we have to understand that in international politics, we categorize people or the scholars, leaders into two types: idealists versus realists. So idealists are those who prioritize international peace, who rely more on international law, strengthening international institutions like UN, and the realists who have an uncompromising attitude towards national security, which rely not on which rely on power or the military power to secure the national interest. So Nehru as an idealist. Nehru is known as an idealist because he always emphasized on the importance of international peace, the need to strengthen international law, international organization. He always, or you can also call that, he neglected India's defense and security. He had more faith on the United Nations led collective security system, and from that perspective he was an idealist. However, we have to understand that if we call Nehru as an idealist in its pure sense of the term, it will not be appropriate, because if for a realist national security is important, we have to understand that nations do not exist in a vacuum. Obviously, there is a close connection between the national security and international peace. So working for international peace cannot be divorced from the national security. If you are working from the international peace, in a way you are also creating more conducive environment for your national security. Often the choices of the means and the strategies that we use depends upon the resources we have, the world order. There are many things that shape a country's options. The world order. We have to understand that India was a newly independent country, a poor nation with the massive challenges faced a divided world of Cold War superpower rivalry, and in this context, the best possible option which India explored was to contribute to international peace to achieve its own national security. So, I will rather prefer to call Nehru's approach as pragmatic, in the sense pragmatic is a combination of idealism and realism, because it is based on the understanding that international peace is a necessary condition for protecting India's core national interest. So maybe in the first lecture you may not be understanding, but gradually once you get some clarity, some maturity, you will start understanding things. So the first I can say that if you read VP Dutt's book of NBT publication, VP Dutt emphasizes on the pragmatism of Nehru and not absolute idealism. Now, you have to understand that being idealistic is being too optimistic. Being realistic means being too pessimistic. So, what is pragmatic? Pragmatic means a balance between your idealism and realism. So obviously pragmatism is the golden mean. Pragmatism is the best possible option, I can say. Now this allegation that Nehru neglected the neighborhood is also unsustainable. Fine. On the other hand, neighborhood was always a priority. And we see that actually neighborhood is a region where neighborhood has been the region where we see that Nehru's pragmatism was heavily tilted towards realism. So neighborhood was the region where Nehru's pragmatism was actually too much tilted towards realism. Fine. So Nehru was acutely conscious of the security challenges in the neighborhood and took actions to ensure the secure and safe neighborhood. And in this context, if I refer to C. Raja Mohan, he has mentioned that as far as the neighborhood policy of Nehru is concerned, we find him a realist and we find that there is more of a continuity with the British Raj than the break. In fact, Pandit Nehru, in terms of the neighborhood relations, continued with the policies of the British. What have been these policies? What have been Nehruvian initiatives? We will see in the next class.